Some of the biggest breakthroughs in history don't come from some super complicated answer. No, they come from asking a stunningly simple question. Today, we're talking about the Nobel laureate Ronald Coase, an economist who totally changed his field just by asking questions so basic, so obvious, that somehow everyone else just missed them.
So let's start with his first big one. And it's a doozy. Why do companies even exist? I mean, it sounds kind of silly to ask, right? We're surrounded by them. They're like the air we breathe in the economy. But if you're an economist, their very existence is, well, it's a genuine puzzle.
And that leads us right into our first major topic, what economists call the mystery of the firm.
Seriously, think about it for a second. In a perfect free market, you just have a bunch of individuals making deals with each other for everything. So why isn't the world just one giant gig economy? Why aren't we all just freelancers? Why do we bother building these big, clunky hierarchies with bosses and departments and all that?
Well, before Ronald Coase showed up back in the 1930s, economists didn't really have a good answer. They just kind of shrugged and accepted it. They treated firms like this mysterious black box. Labor and materials go in one end and products come out the other. But nobody was really looking inside to see how it all worked, or more importantly, why it worked that way.
But Coase, he decided to peek inside that box. And what he found was the first big clue, a kind of hidden cost that's attached to pretty much everything we do.
He gave it a name, transaction costs. And this, right here, is the key to everything. It's not the price tag on the item. It's all the other stuff, all the hassle and effort that goes into making a deal happen in the first place. You could call it the cost of using the market.
And these costs are everywhere, and they're super relatable. I mean, think about it. The time you spend searching for a decent plumber, the back and forth of haggling over the price, drawing up a contract, even just checking to make sure they did a good job. All of that, those are transaction costs. You're paying them with your time and your energy.
Let's use building a house as an example. You could go out and hire a dozen different freelancers, a plumber here, an electrician there, but man, that's a dozen different searches, a dozen negotiations, a dozen contracts to manage. Or you could just hire one general contractor. That one company takes care of all that coordination, slashing your personal transaction costs.
And that's the whole point, the big reveal. A company isn't the opposite of a free market, it's a response to it. A firm is basically this little island where it's cheaper to just tell an employee what to do rather than go out and negotiate a new contract on the open market for every single little task. Companies exist to minimize transaction costs. Simple as that.
Okay, so puzzle number one solved. But Coase didn't stop there. He then turned that big brain of his to another classic economic problem, externalities. All those unintended side effects of doing business, with pollution being the classic example. And he explained it with this simple story that's become legendary in economics. So you've got a cattle rancher. His cows keep wandering over to the neighbor's farm and chowing down on the crops. That's that negative externality. The rancher's business is literally eating into the farmer's business. Now, the old school answer was, well, the government has to step in, make a rule, levy a tax. But Coase asked a different question. Hang on, is there another way? So look at the setup. The rancher wants to raise more cattle. The farmer wants to grow more crops. But the wandering cows are creating this direct conflict. The really important question here isn't just who's to blame, it's what's the best, most efficient outcome for everyone involved.
And this led him to his second massive insight, which we now call the Coase theorem. It's basically a three-step recipe for solving problems. 1, a property right has to be clearly defined. And get this, it doesn't even matter who gets the right at first. Just make it clear. 2, let the two parties negotiate. And 3, if it's cheap and easy for them to talk, if the transaction costs are low, they'll figure out the most efficient solution all by themselves. No government required.
And this is the part that's kind of mind-bending. Coase showed that the final outcome, whether the rancher pays the farmer for the damage or the farmer pays the rancher to build a better fence, that outcome will be the most economically efficient one, no matter who had the rights to begin with. All that matters is that they can bargain their way to the best solution. So, let's take a step back. We've got two huge but totally different sounding ideas, right? One explains why a massive corporation like Apple or Ford exists. The other explains how a farmer and a rancher can settle a dispute over some cows. What on earth is the connection? This is the question that really shows you the genius of Ronald Coase. What's that one, single, elegant idea that ties these two huge puzzles together? Well, let's look at puzzle number one again. Why do firms exist?
because it's a huge pain to negotiate everything on the open market. It's often cheaper to organize things inside a company. So firms exist because transaction costs are high.
And puzzle number 2, why can the farmer and rancher solve their own problem? Because it's just two people talking over a fence. It's easy for them to negotiate. Private deals work when transaction costs are low.
And boom, there it is, the grand unifying theory. Coase's entire life's work really boiled down to one thing: dragging economics out of the clouds and forcing it to look at the messy, gritty, real-world friction and costs that are involved anytime people try to cooperate and make a deal.
And that fundamental insight just started a revolution in the field. So let's wrap this up by talking about why this way of thinking is still so incredibly important.
It took decades after he first asked these simple questions, but the world eventually caught up. In 1991, Ronald Coase was awarded the Nobel Prize. And it was this huge validation, this recognition that looking at the world as it is can be way more powerful than just making models of how we think it should be.
There's this great quote that's often attributed to him, and it just perfectly captures his whole vibe. He was really skeptical of these super complex mathematical models that had no connection to reality. For him, just observing the real world was everything. And that, right there, is his real legacy. Before Coase, a lot of economics was a purely theoretical, abstract thing. He basically grabbed the entire field by the shoulders, turned it around, and forced it to look out the window at the real companies, the real contracts, and the real people trying to get things done.
Which leaves us with a final big question for today. If Coase was right, and the real barrier to solving problems is often just the cost of getting people to coordinate, what does that mean for us, right now, in an age of instant global communication? What massive problems, from climate change down to neighborhood disputes, could we solve, not by adding more rules, but just by making it radically cheaper and easier for the right people to sit down and make a deal?